Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'm Dave, you're the audience, and this is another great presentation offered to you by Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site. I know I say this a lot on almost every one of these, but I am actually above and beyond excited for this program. We're going to have a really good time. I'm very certain of that, because with us tonight is Martha Capwell Fox, who is the Historian and Archives Coordinator for the National Canal Museum and the Delaware Lehigh National Heritage Corridor, having been there and part of these organizations in various capacities since 1990. She is passionate about preserving and presenting our local history, or their local history, as it were, because of its major national significance. She's been a professional writer and editor who has written 9 books on historical topics ranging from swimming, auto racing, and the Lehigh Valley cement industry, also the Vatican, and the DNL's new book on the industrial history of the corridor. Martha has also been managing the archives of the DNL and National Canal Museum since 2012. She helps to create and maintain the museum's exhibits and takes an occasional turn aboard the DNL canal boat, the Josiah White II. She loves going out into the communities along the corridor to meet people and tell stories, along with doing various talks, demonstrating and showing the photographs and films. And in that capacity this evening, she's doing that through the internet, through the Inter-Cyber WebNet, and virtually via WebEx. So please join me in welcoming Martha Capwell Fox from the National Canal Museum.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for Dave's invitation and Dave's lovely introduction. I'm really very happy to be able to be speaking to somebody that's far away. And I'm always really very excited to tell our story to as far as wide as I possibly can. As you can see by the first slide there, the Lehigh Navigation is subtitled How a Waterway Changed the Nation. And I'm going to sort of give away the end of the story, as it were, by starting out by saying that how this waterway changed the nation is that it gave birth to the American Industrial Revolution. This is the basis for our designation as a National Heritage Corridor. The Delaware and Lehigh was the second or third such designation in the United States, and it has been so designated since 1988. So it isn't just us saying that this is nationally significant history. It was actually originally the Park Service and the U.S. Congress. So I'm boasting, but I have reason to boast. So if I can have the first slide, please. Okay, now this is a map, not terribly large scale, I'm afraid, of the Lehigh Navigation as it mostly existed from the late 1820s until actually well into the 20th century. Parts of this were still navigable until 1942. Essentially, what it was a waterway which stretched from the town of Mock Chunk, which is currently called Jim Thorpe, which is right inside the southernmost part of the anthracite fields. And it follows the Lehigh River from Mock Chunk down to where it empties into the Delaware River in Easton. So if you're familiar at all with this part of Pennsylvania, this is the waterway that connects from the mountains to the Delaware and about 60 miles north of Philadelphia. As you can see, there were quite a few locks. There was a pretty good change in elevation on there. It was about 375 feet altogether coming down from the mountains. We'll talk a bit about the mechanism of the canal in a bit, but first we want to go to the next slide, which really is the beginning of the story. The black areas in this map are the various anthracite coal fields, and this really is the beginning of the story. Anthracite is found in about 8 or 9 places in the entire world, but northeastern Pennsylvania is the largest single deposit of it. And in an area of only about 400 square miles exists the largest and deepest pocket of anthracite, which, as you can see, however, those fields are a bit separated. The one that we are mostly going to be talking about today is the southernmost one. The narrow band there is what's known as the Mammoth Vein, and that was the largest, still is the largest anthracite deposit actually in the world. It's still being strip mined in a few places, but by and large, of course, the anthracite business has declined. But the section, that narrow section there that reaches to Mauch Chunk on the Lehigh, is the real beginnings of our story. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, anthracite was so abundant that it was discovered at different times by different people in a couple different parts of what we call the coal regions now in Pennsylvania. And it was so abundant that basically to get it at first, all they needed to do was scrape off basically the topsoil, which geologists call the overburden, and quarry it. So getting it out of the ground was not a particularly difficult thing. However, in the late 18th century and early 19th century, that part of Pennsylvania where the coal was located, which is to say between the present day Wilkes-Barre and Scranton to the north and the Lehigh Valley to the south, was largely uninhabited. The Native Americans had been driven out, and there was virtually no one living in that area. So when the fuel was discovered in a few different places, no one really had any idea that it had any value or that there was any good reason to exploit it for any reason. This changed, however, beginning in the 1790s. This is a drawing from the 19th century of the first successful coal mine. And you can see that this is a quarry. It was in what is now the town of Summit Hill, which is in Carbon County, and at the top of a mountain. And it was first opened in 1792. The problem was, as easy as it was to get the coal out of the ground, delivering it to some place where there was a large enough market to make mining coal economically successful was another story altogether. Plus the fact that anthracite was a new fuel and there was no pressing need to go to a new fuel, at least not at first. Of course, by and large, the fuel that was used in the United States in the late 18th and early 19th century was wood. And this was fine for quite some time because there was a great abundance of wood, and there was also, of course, some water power with the various rivers. But by the early 19th century, this part of Pennsylvania, in eastern Pennsylvania and in central New Jersey, had basically been clear cut. So wood was becoming very scarce and very expensive. And by about 1805 or so, places like Philadelphia were beginning to experience a very real energy crisis. So although the first couple of companies that attempted to exploit this coal in Carbon County and then tried to get it to Philadelphia by rather inefficient means, failed. And so it was very unsuccessful. And this mine was abandoned repeatedly into the early 19th century. But in the meantime, because of the shortage of fuel, of wood, places like Philadelphia were beginning to use bituminous coal, which was coming from two sources. One was the mountains of Virginia in the highlands where the James River arose. And that meant it was being put on boats, brought down the James River, down Chesapeake Bay, around the eastern shore of Maryland and Virginia, and brought up Delaware Bay to Philadelphia. The other and actually bigger source of bituminous was as ballast coming from ships that were coming from Britain. And so people were getting used to using coal as a fuel, but that all came to a screeching halt when the United States went to war with Great Britain in 1812. And the British Navy promptly blockaded the coast. And this resulted in the end of coal being delivered to Philadelphia. Can I have the next slide, please? That was the year that the two men in this image decided to go into business at the Falls of the Schuylkill in Philadelphia in a mill where they were making wire and nails. The man on the left is named Josiah White, and the man on the right is Erskine Hazard. Now, White was a self-made man. He was a Quaker who was originally from New Jersey, and he had made quite a good fortune in the hardware business, to the point where he had retired before he was 30 and decided he was going to spend the rest of his life doing good with his money. But he was, first of all, unfortunately rocked by the death of a young wife, which threw him into sort of an emotional tailspin and left him not really sure what he wanted to do with his life. And second of all, he, like a lot of educated Americans at that time, and he was not that well educated, but self-educated, knew that there was really no industrial development comparable to what was happening in Britain and in Europe here in the United States. So he was very interested in manufacturing and promoting manufacturing. His partner, Erskine Hazard, on the other hand, was the offspring of a very well-connected and very wealthy family in Philadelphia. His grandfather had founded Princeton, which Hazard himself graduated from at the age of 19. And his father was the first Postmaster General of the United States and also founded one of the very first insurance companies. So he was well off and also well connected. And the two of them went into this partnership with making wire and nails. Now, unfortunately, with the advent of the War of 1812, their whole fuel situation became very, very tenuous. And so even though there was only very small amounts of anthracite that were making it to Philadelphia from a mine or two that were still operating, they were bringing it down by wagons. The loads were very, very small, 2 or 3 tons at most. And White and Hazard purchased one of those loads and put it in the furnace in their wire mill. And they tried and tried and tried for an entire day to get it to light. The problem with anthracite as a fuel is that it's very hard, has a very high carbon content, and it's difficult to get it to ignite. When it does burn, however, it makes a very, very hot fire that lasts for quite some time. And this was all qualities of this fuel that they didn't actually recognize because no one had really studied it. So they attempted to use it for fuel in one of their furnaces so that they could soften bar iron and draw it into wire and hammer it into nails. And they couldn't get it to light. And so they closed the furnace, sent everyone home, and went home for the night. However, a few hours later, one of their workmen realized that he had left his jacket in the mill, and he went back. He opened the door of the building, and it was warm inside. This was apparently in November or so. And when he went and looked at the furnace, it was red hot. What they had unwittingly discovered was that to burn anthracite, you put it in a closed furnace and you give it an updraft air. And that was what they'd done. He summoned White, who somehow, in those days of no mass communication, brought back his workers in the middle of the night. And overnight, they did a full day's worth of work on that one load of anthracite. Now, they had unwittingly discovered the best way to use anthracite as an industrial fuel. But it was the wrong time, and it wasn't until 1818 that they ventured into the anthracite business themselves, and they started out doing this by purchasing that quarry mine up there in Summit Hill. Then White realized, probably even beforehand, realized that the issue with becoming successful in the anthracite business was conquering the transportation problem. There were very few roads that came down from the mountains of Pennsylvania. And in any case, the wagons of the day couldn't carry more than about 4 or 5 tons at most. And so it was way more costly to transport the anthracite from the mines to a sizable market like Philadelphia, which was the only way that anybody could make money in this business. So knowing this, and knowing that the best way to transport a heavy, bulky cargo like coal in an economical manner was by water, White and a partner, temporary partner that they had, a pseudo-German nobleman who lied about his wealth and his connections and everything about him. Nevertheless, he spoke German, which was actually very useful in going to the legislature in Harrisburg because most of them only spoke German too. So they went to the legislature in Harrisburg. And White pointed out to the legislature that it would be good for the United States and it would be good for Pennsylvania if anthracite could be transported in an economical manner so that it could be used widely as a fuel and take over from the rapidly disappearing wood stocks that people were burning up rapidly, particularly in the iron industry. So actually, the legislature said to them, of course, you may have the Lehigh River. You may not only have the Lehigh, you may have control of the water rights. That proved to be a major source of money in the later existence of the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company. You may have the tributaries. You may have the islands in the river. You may have the land on either bank of the river. Don't worry, we're going to get this back in nothing flat. Everyone goes bust in this silly anthracite business. Well, as a matter of fact, Pennsylvania got the Lehigh River back in 1966. It was the only privately owned river in the United States. So, armed with their very own river and their very own coal mine, White and Hazard removed themselves to the virtually non-existent village of Mock Chunk, which was at the base of the mountain 9 miles below where the mine in Summit Hill was. Can I have the next slide, please? And White's idea for making the Lehigh River navigable was this design, which was known as a bear trap dam. Now, this might have been a sort of misdirection. There's a lot of controversy about whether or not this was actually what these things were called. But, and the one story which may be apocryphal goes that when someone noticed where they were building on land, prior to putting structures into the river, they were told they were building bear trap. It seems unlikely, but whatever. The issue that they were faced with was the fact that although the Lehigh River was right there, going from the coal mine area down to the connection to the Delaware River, the Lehigh in its natural state is a completely unnavigable river. It is very shallow and rocky in a lot of places. In other places, it's deep and slow moving, very prone to flooding, and just all in all, completely unacceptable as a river for moving any type of cargo on it, particularly anything heavy. So the Bear Trap Dam was a very clever take on a hydrostatic dam in that it was about a 3 or 4 foot high dam made of rock and wood cribbing. And on one side, close to the bank, was this overlapping gate, which there was a chute into it that allowed the water from behind the dam to go underneath the gate and hold the gate up. On the side of that was a wicket that was connected to a rod that protruded from the top of the dam. And so what they did was they loaded the coal onto a series of what amounted to just simply boxes, about 8 feet square, about 2 feet deep. Each one held about 2 or 3 tons of coal. And they chained them together, and about 8 or 10 of these boxes together. And they floated them in the pond that was behind the dam. And then when they had a sufficiency of them, someone at the beginning of the first boat would get off on top of the dam, turn the wicket so that the water was no longer holding the gate up. The gate collapsed, the upstream pond rushed through the now open area of the dam, and it carried all of those boxes of coal all lumped together down to the next dam. There were 13 of these on the Lehigh in the 46 miles between Mock Chunk and Easton. And although it was probably a pretty exciting trip, this actually worked. Can I have the next slide, please? Now here is a better image. I hope that you can see this largely enough that shows the actual bear trap in operation. This is from a letterhead from the Lehigh Coal and Navigation from 1827. So this is right before the two-way navigation was built. And you can see in the foreground one of these so-called coal arcs, and it is coming down. You might be able to see in this that there's a man in the first one who has a fending pole and a man at the back with a sweep oar. And this must have been a pretty uncomfortable trip down the Lehigh and then subsequently down the Delaware to Philadelphia. But it succeeded because this process began in 1819, and in 1820, they delivered over 28,000 tons of anthracite to Philadelphia. And as fast as they could get it to Philadelphia, they could sell it because people just loved using this. By that point, there were enough fireplace inserts and freestanding stoves that had been developed that could contain the incredibly high heat of anthracite, because anthracite was the hottest burning solid fuel that had ever been used by humanity. And so it took some other technological developments to make it useful for heating and cooking. But it was a very efficient way to heat. And there were, by that point, quite a few very large buildings in Philadelphia, including hospitals, the State House that we now call Independence Hall. And this was an excellent way to heat all of these very large buildings, as well as lots and lots of houses. The other thing about anthracite, which people loved, was the fact that when anthracite burns, it does not smoke. Now, of course, it gives off all of the noxious elements that we know about, but they didn't know that at the time. All they cared about was that for once they were no longer living in wood smoke. And so it was an extremely popular fuel. And White and Hazard, who to that point had been made fun of and had been the butt of jokes and of doubt, by this point were proving that they had definitely worked out an efficient way to move this very valuable fuel. Can I have the next slide, please? This is a very early, actually 1830, watercolor by a Swiss artist named Karl Bodmer. I'll tell you about Bodmer in a minute, but first I want to tell you what we are looking at. White and Hazard were between them probably one of the first of the early wonderfully creative and inventive people. And this is another example, not only of their invention, but also of their persistence. This is the end of the Gravity Railroad, the 9 miles of railroad that came from the mine at Summit Hill down to the banks of the Lehigh. Originally, the road that brought the coal carts down from the mine had been constructed in 1819. And it was the first road in the United States that was built with a standard declivity, meaning that it had a standard regular descent down the hill. It didn't follow the terrain up and down like sort of a roller coaster. Hazard is generally credited with doing that work of figuring out how to build that road. And there are places where you can still hike on that road in the parks that surround the town of Jim Thorpe that follow the path of what later became the Switchback Railroad. The Gravity Railroad came down on that same path because White and Hazard had the foresight to basically build a road first that then could have stone sleepers and wooden rails with iron straps on them to come down from the mine. It was actually the first usable railroad that was created in the United States. And for a little while, it was not only the only one, but like the longest one. And so the coal cars could roll down from the mountain and the coal could be dumped by gravity into these boats. If you're familiar with the design of Durham boats, this appears in 1832 to be what they were still pretty much using to transport the coal down to Philadelphia was Durham boats. These do not look like the canal boats that were definitely in use by about 1840. The story of Bodmer, very quickly, is that he was accompanying Prince Maximilian of Germany. And Maximilian was basically the world's first anthropologist, and he was very interested in the Native Americans. And he had intended and finally actually carried out a trip to the Central Plains. And he and Bodmer spent many years actually traveling around the middle part of the country. And there's actually a museum in Omaha, which contains a lot of Bodmer's work because it was the only way that Maximilian could, of course, record what he was seeing. However, they traveled a bit around the Northeast before they set off via the Erie Canal, I have read, for the Midwest. And Mauch Chunk was one of the places that they visited. So we're very lucky to have this eyewitness rendering of what the Gravity Railroad looked at the time. So White and Hazard were uniquely positioned by virtue of the fact that they were able to move their coal down their railroad, load it on their boats, take it down their river, and later their two-way canal, and deliver it to their coal docks in Philadelphia. It was a kind of monopoly that even at the time caused a lot of jealousy. The state had unwittingly conferred all of this upon them, figuring that they would not succeed in this, what looked like risky and dubious business. And White and Hazard definitely proved them wrong. Next slide, please. So this is a view from the top of one of the mountains that overlooks the current town of Jim Thorpe. This is after, many years later, after the two-way navigation. The trouble with the original bear trap system was that it was one way. And it also did limit the quantity of coal that could be carried down at any one time. So once the Erie was completed in 1825, White and Hazard were aware of the fact that there was now sufficient civil engineering knowledge in this country to begin to construct the two-way navigation between Mauch Chunk and Easton. And they also had the good sense and the humility in hiring Canvas White, who had learned quite a great deal about building canals on the Erie. So Canvas White came to Pennsylvania in 1827 and began to direct the construction of the two-way canal. Now, this is known as a navigation because it incorporated the river in multiple places all the way down the course of the waterway down to Easton. And this picture shows in pretty good detail how all of that worked. In the middle of the picture there, you can see still the bottom of the Gravity Railroad with the boats gathered around it. And that black line that's down toward the bottom on the right-hand side is actually the dam. It was the first dam that was constructed, the first of 9 that were built on the Lehigh. And to the extreme right of the picture is the entrance to the canal itself and through Lock 1 at Mauch Chunk. Now, this was a really brilliant design, and it's kind of unknown if this was all Canvas White's idea, if it was White and Hazard's idea, if they obviously worked out multiple issues as they went along in the 2.5 years it took to build the two-way navigation. But the dams did 2 important things. First of all, they made the good old rocky, shallow Lehigh deep enough and slow enough for about a mile behind each one of the dams for the canal boats to travel on. And the boats grew to the point where they could carry 100 tons of coal. So they did need about 6 or 7 feet of draft. And the other thing that the dams did was that they also put water into the ditch parts of the canal. And this was really an important achievement because an awful lot of canals in the 19th century had trouble staying watered. And that was because of the dams never really an issue on the Lehigh navigation. So in about 30 years, this picture was taken in shortly before the Civil War. Mauch Chunk had become a fairly substantial town, owing to the fact that not only was Lehigh Coal and Navigation's coal being loaded on the canal boats there, but also coal that was coming from other mines that were further up the river from the Lehigh Navigation's coal fields. Can I have the next slide, please? At the other end of the canal in Easton was a real illustration of the value that the water power that the Lehigh Coal and Navigation had conferred upon them by the legislature. This is the area which is around the Lock 47 area in Southeastern. Lock 47 still exists. It's part of our system here in Hugh Park. However, all of these industrial buildings are long gone. This was essentially the first industrial park in the United States, and it was flourishing even before the Twoway Canal was completed in 1829. The water power from the canal actually powered a vast variety of businesses. The big building that's standing here was a cotton mill, where they wove things like mattress ticking and things like that. But there were very large wire mills here. There was actually at one point a factory that made whiskey stills, and one of the first, although a failed, iron furnace that attempted to use anthracite coal to smelt the iron. And this remained a very busy industrial area until the beginning of the 20th century. And it failed because these businesses had become so addicted to what amounted to nearly free, not totally free, but nearly free water power from Lehigh Coal and Navigation that most of them never installed steam engines. And so they lost out to other businesses in the Lehigh Valley that had modernized, and that was the end of it. Can I have the next slide, please? But this is the real breakthrough that White and Hazard and the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company achieved. As I said earlier, as educated Americans, they were painfully aware of the fact that we were more than 100 years behind Britain in terms of industrial development. And that was pretty much entirely due to the fact that we were still using charcoal in this country to smelt iron with, and not any other kind of fuel, because until the canals came along and began to transport the anthracite, there was no alternative to charcoal. The problems with charcoal are manifold. For one thing, it takes an acre of hardwood trees to make enough charcoal to make half a ton of iron, and half a ton of iron is not all that much. And as the trees began to be cut down, it forced the iron furnaces to move further and further west away from the centers of population, because they had to be close to where they could get wood. And this actually had led by about 1810 to 1815 to the fact that most of the iron in this country was actually imported, because the domestic iron could not compete on cost because they were so remote from the population areas. And people in America were acutely aware of the fact that what was powering the Industrial Revolution in Britain was, in fact, coal. So White and Hazard and a number of other investigators and scientists and industrialists had attempted pretty much all the way through the 1830s, as anthracite became more commonly used and more canals began to bring anthracite out of northeastern Pennsylvania and to places as disparate as Boston and Baltimore, and even Charleston in the Carolinas, began to experiment with making iron in furnaces using anthracite. But again, the technology was just not up to it in this country. Finally, in 1837, a Welsh ironmaster named David Thomas, who worked for a man named George Crane, had perfected a furnace that not only could contain the incredible heat of anthracite, and his furnace was near a strain of anthracite that was actually located in Wales. But George Crane had purchased the patent rights to James Nielsen's hot blast. And those two incredibly hot sources of energy were what were allowing Thomas to make very large quantities of very high quality iron. So in 1838, Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company sent Erskine Hazard and his son Alexander to Wales, originally with the idea of buying the patent rights for North America to the Crane and Thomas process. But when Hazard got there, he realized that what they really needed was someone to come to Pennsylvania and do this. And so he and David Thomas's wife persuaded David Thomas to sign a contract with Lehigh Coal and Navigation to come to Pennsylvania for 5 years and build a furnace on their canal that would use their anthracite to smelt iron. Mrs. Thomas really wound up having the final say because she persuaded her husband, who was already nearly 40 and was over 40 actually, and had a successful career, was very well known in his field. But she persuaded him that their sons would have more opportunity in the United States than they would if they stayed in the UK. And she was right, actually. So he signed a contract on New Year's Eve in 1838, and in the late spring of 1839, he arrived in Pennsylvania. It wasn't until July that he and his son Samuel walked to the site that Lehigh Navigation had purchased for him to build his ironworks. It was along Lock 36 on the Navigation. At the time, it was a settlement of German-speaking farmers and a family that ran a toll bridge, but there was no other development. But what was important there was that there was enough water power in that part of the canal to drive the water wheels that Thomas was going to have to build to power his blowing engines for his furnace. And he must have felt like he was thrust back into history, because in Britain, he was used to using steam engines to do that. But there wasn't enough of the technology or the quantity of iron to build big enough steam engines to do that sort of work. So he needed to build water wheels, which in fact were 12 feet in diameter and 24 feet across. They actually dug a separate channel in the canal so that they could tap enough of the water power to do that. And the amazing thing is that Thomas broke ground for his first furnace, which is visible at the left-hand side of this picture, in August, and he put it into blast the following 3rd of July. And on the 4th of July, 1840, he made his first cast, and that cast was more than a charcoal-fired furnace could make in a week. And that really was the beginning of the American Industrial Revolution, because for the first time, it was possible to make large quantities of very good iron in a very short period of time. And this was possible because the canal was able to bring the anthracite and also in some cases the limestone that was needed for this process, and then to carry away the pig iron to foundries and places where it could be turned into some sort of product that would be useful for people, whether it was for building bridges or making implements for farms, and eventually, of course, for making rails and building the railroad. Now, this picture is actually of the town of Catasauqua as it had grown between 1840 and 1854. And this is still, the town is still in existence. There's no remnant anymore, really, of the iron business. But this was the very first place, and this occurred entirely because it was located on the canal. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is the second anthracite furnace, which was also built on the canal. In 1842, a group of investors in Boston hired an English ironmaster named William Firmstone, and he came to the United States, consulted with David Thomas, and looked around for a likely place to build another water-powered anthracite-fired furnace. And he looked around several places until Thomas directed him to this site in Glendon, which is a little bit west of Easton, on the Lehigh Canal and also on the Lehigh River. And so it took him 2 years to build his first furnace. It was put into blast in 1844. And this ultimately became the largest of the anthracite iron furnaces, known as the Glendon Ironworks. This is actually where I am located this very moment, in Hugh Park. And if you come to visit us, which I hope you will find that there is very, very little remnant of the fact that this was once an enormous industrial site. This park is absolutely bucolic now. We do, however, have this section of the canal that you see here in the picture. And we'd like to say that this picture is sort of the composite of the entire story of the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor. Because here we have the coal, not only piled up there on the side, but still in one of the boats that's in the canal itself, an anthracite-fired iron furnace, which by that point had 9 furnaces in it. This picture dates from about the 1880s. And of course, in the foreground is the Lehigh Valley Railroad, with the tracks that were made in Bethlehem, just up the stream, and were, of course, by that point also made of steel. But this is just emblematic of what happened all up and down the Lehigh, both along the canal and just across the river, which eventually turned the Lehigh Valley until late in the 1860s into the center of iron production in the United States. The anthracite was abundant, the water power was abundant, and the transportation system was extremely efficient. Of course, on the other hand, as we like to say, particularly on our boat talk, as we glide alongside the Lehigh Valley Railroad right-of-way, which is now Norfolk Southern, that the canals planted the seeds of their own destruction because they made it possible to build train cars and locomotives and rails. And so in the long run, this was what cost the canals their existence. But it took a long time before the canals were really obliterated in most places in eastern Pennsylvania, because the economies of moving large quantities of anthracite, as long as it didn't need to be delivered in a hurry, the railroads were not able to beat the canal's price in many of the markets until almost 1900. Can I have the next slide, please? Well, this is a picture I included largely so that I could show what the navigation looked like when it was completely intact, and also another one of the major iron furnaces on the far side of the river. This is dam number 6 and guard lock 6, just a little about a mile and a half above the site of David Thomas's Crane Ironworks. On the far left in this picture, you can see the wickets that control the feeder gate. And that was where it allowed the water from the river. What you can't see in this picture is that the dam had an angle on it and made it known as a wing dam. And that fed the water directly from behind the dam through the feeder gate into the canal. And this was very important because there were quite a few businesses along the entire stretch of the canal between here and Allentown that relied on the canal for either transportation of raw materials or for water power. And in the foreground is the guard lock, which allowed the boats to pass from the slack water pool behind the dam back into the ditch part of the canal, and also vice versa, out of the canal ditch and into the slack water part of the river. So there were places where the towpath for the canal ran along the canal, obviously, and then other places where the towpath actually still does run along the riverbank. And on the far end of it is the Thomas Ironworks, which was named in honor of and actually run by David Thomas's sons and grandson. That was really the most advanced of the ironworks that existed, and it was eventually taken over briefly by Bethlehem Steel, but it finally came to grief in the early years of the Depression, and so it was the last iron furnace that was standing, and it was demolished at that point. Next slide, please. This is another one of the very successful, although somewhat more short-lived furnaces. This is in Perryville, which is in Carbon County. It was also on the canal, but it had less reliance on it because between the canal and the ironworks was the Lehigh Valley, no, the Central Railroad of New Jersey, which actually had leased the Lehigh and Susquehanna Railroad from Lehigh Coal and Navigation. So it was also a major coal carrier. But carbon furnace, which was begun shortly after the Civil War, operated until the 1890s, and there is no trace of this still in existence. However, this part of the canal is actually still there. It's a beautiful picture. It's obviously was taken about 1885, and it was done on a glass negative. Next one, please. Very quickly, this is an image of another really important linchpin of the entire anthracite canals network. And this is where, known as the Forks of the Delaware, the Lehigh to the right of the picture empties over the dam number 9, into the Delaware River. And in the middle background is the entrance to the Delaware Canal. And then what's a little bit more difficult to pick out in this picture is the outlet lock that allowed boats to be towed by a cable ferry across the Delaware River and enter into the Morris Canal. So this was the way that coal was delivered directly to New York Harbor from the coal fields in Mock Chunk, mostly by Morris Canal boats. So the Lehigh boats also used the Morris Canal to reach into New York Harbor. I understand you had to talk about the Morris Canal, so you know quite a bit about that, which was an amazing engineering feat as well. And this also became a very important method for transporting magnetite from the mines in New Jersey, which were far better iron ore than anything that was found in Pennsylvania, in this part of Pennsylvania anyway. So Morris boats and Lehigh boats tended to make the return trip from New York, carrying magnetite to deliver to the iron furnaces in the Lehigh Valley and up into Carbon County. Lots of people ask if they all came back empty, and they actually came back loaded in a lot of cases, in all directions, by carrying a lot of other freight, although coal remained the major cargo for the entire existence of all three canals. Next slide, please. Now, this is a look. This is truly amazing because this is an engraving from 1859. Now, bear in mind that the Twoway Canal had only been completed in 1829. The Morris Canal, which is in the foreground here, was completed in 1832. And this in 1860, less than 30 years later, there was all this industrialization, these enormous iron bridges and these train tracks, and the spread and the development of the city of Easton in the background there, and Phillipsburg, which you can't really see much of, but Phillipsburg was also a major manufacturing area in the foreground. It's amazing to realize that in the space of about 20 years, anthracite completely replaced wood as the energy source and the basis of the economy of the entire northeastern and upper Midwest portions of the United States. It only took 20 years. And all of this was the result. So this is truly, this is actually a pre-Civil War engraving, and the amount of development here is just really astounding when you consider that this in 1840 was a town of about, maybe about 2,000 people. And by this point, it was a city of like 25,000. It was actually bigger in 1860 than it is now. Next slide, please. Okay, two men who had a lot to do with the later development, Asa Packer and Robert Sayre. No accident that they were both from Mock Chunk. Asa Packer actually made his fortune. First of all, ironically, on the canal. He came to Mock Chunk penniless in the early 1830s, briefly became a canal boat captain, then built himself 2 canal boats, hired his brother-in-law to run one of them, and hired somebody else while he stayed in Mock Chunk and built up a business supplying the things that the canal needed to move their goods, and also for the people who were running the canal boats. Eventually, his self-taught engineering, and the carpentry skills that he had learned as a very young man led him to help to build the Upper Grand section, which basically canalized the Lehigh River through the Lehigh Gorge from Mock Chunk up to Whitehaven, which was another enormous engineering achievement. The locks that were built on the Upper Grand were sometimes as much as 30 feet deep. And that means they had 30-foot high canal gates, and that took a lot of lumber and a lot of carpentry skill, and Asa Packer was the man for that. He accumulated enough money to eventually buy out a sort of flailing company that was attempting to build a railroad that would challenge the canal by running down the other bank of the Lehigh River. And to accomplish that job, he hired Robert Sayre. Now, Sayre had been born in Mock Chunk. His father was the waylock manager for Lehigh Navigation. And he had a tremendous education just absolutely on the job from the time that he was about 15. He worked on the Morris Canal. He worked on the enlargement of the inclined planes there. And he was only 30 when Sayre tapped him to complete the construction of the Lehigh Valley Railroad from Mauch Chunk to Easton. And he did accomplish this. Then he persuaded Packer to move the headquarters of the Lehigh Valley Railroad to Bethlehem, South Bethlehem, as a matter of fact, because that was where the North Penn Railroad was coming up from Philadelphia to junction with the Lehigh Valley. And that proved to be a crucial decision that affected the entire Lehigh Valley for the next 150 years. Can I have the next slide, please? Because once he had the railroad established, and including had that amazing bridge built across the Delaware into New Jersey that we saw in that other slide, Packer decided that he wanted his own company to make rails for his railroad because he was having to buy them from one of his competitors, Scranton. And so this was not a good idea as far as he was concerned. So he directed Sayre to build an iron foundry on the south side of the Lehigh, away from the canal, and to dedicate that factory, to making rails for the Lehigh Valley Railroad. So Sayre began to build this ironworks at the beginning of the Civil War, which made things rather difficult. But he did persuade John Fritz, who had invented a revolutionary and efficient way of rolling train rails. While he was at the Cambria Ironworks, he persuaded Fritz to bring himself and his patent to Bethlehem. And Fritz did that, and he came to Bethlehem in 1861. They began to make rails in 1863. So for a while, they were simply a rolling mill. And then later on, in the 1870s, Fritz persuaded Sayre, and Sayre persuaded Packer and the board and the people who controlled Bethlehem Iron to move into the steel business. And this drawing, this watercolor by a Moravian artist named Rufus Grider, shows the result of Fritz's energy, which matched Sayre's just one-on-one for their entire working life together, where he built what became known as the cruciform building, which is what is the image here, in which molten iron that was produced in their furnaces came in one end of that building. And depending on which way it was directed, once it got into the cruciform building, it either rolled out as iron rails or iron bars, or it was put in a Bessemer converter, which wasn't the first one by any stretch of the imagination, but a Bessemer converter in there, and then that was rolled into steel train tracks. This became, of course, eventually Bethlehem Steel. And it's the steel's impact on the Lehigh Valley was just enormous until just about the beginning of this century, when it finally shut down. But as you can see, the canal was in the foreground. This was drawn in the late in the late 1870s, shortly before Grider removed himself actually to the Seneca Valley, because he became very disturbed that what had once been beautiful farmland in the Lehigh Valley was being turned into a huge industrial site. So he moved to upstate New York, where he found peace and a new career recording and drawing the carved powder horns that Revolutionary War soldiers made and handed down through their families who remained in that part of New York. Next slide, please. So this is a very early Fritz patented process using open hearth technology, which was the way that he very quickly moved them from Bessemer process into making steel that way. It was an enormous step in steel making in the United States. It was first carried out in Bethlehem. By this point, now we're talking about the 1880s, the iron business had been hammered by the repeated panics in the U.S. economy, particularly the Panic of 1873. And a lot of the iron furnaces that only simply made pig iron had gone out of business by this time. But Bethlehem weathered every one of these panics by the foresight of people like Sayre and Fritz to keep developing the technology. and this open hearth process, which was pretty much untested, and Fritz essentially invented and perfected, at least at Bethlehem, became really crucial because it was this way of making steel that allowed them to go into making armaments and armor plate for the U.S. Navy later on in the 19th century. Next slide. Okay. Now, the other thing that's really interesting, and another part of the factor that persuaded Congress to designate us as the National Heritage Corridor, was the fact that it was not only iron and later steel that came to characterize industry and innovation and actually market dominance in this area. There were other industries as well. One of them was cement. The Lehigh Valley was the first place where large quantities of cement were produced in large-scale kilns. That was largely thanks to the fact that Canvas White had come down with the recipe for hydraulic cement. And he taught several people in the course of building the canal how to make that. And one of the places that they discovered very useful deposits of limestone was along the banks of the Lehigh River. And there was small-scale cement making until shortly after the Civil War, when the man on the left, David Sayre, actually perfected making Portland cement, which had not been made in the United States prior to that point. This partly came about because when the Lehigh Valley Railroad came down the west bank of the Lehigh, they blasted their way through a cliff near a town that is now called Copley, and they exposed an enormous vein of the perfect combination of limestones to make Portland cement. So Sayre, with some partners from Allentown, started the first successful Portland cement making process. And in a very short period of time, he became so successful that the government started to buy both his natural hydraulic cement and his Portland cement for projects that were some of the earliest Army Corps of Engineer projects, like the East jetties. And so this established the cement industry, and this brought a lot of other people running, because it became apparent from geologic studies that, like anthracite beforehand, there was this abundance of this particular kind of limestone. It was very close to the surface. And there is still in existence 5 cement companies that are still aligned through the Lehigh Valley along this formation that's known as the Jacksonburg Formation, which is a very rich vein of limestone. The man on the right is a Spanish-born entrepreneur named Jose de Navarro. And I could talk forever about Navarro, but in what we're focusing on here was his role in the cement business, which he became interested in fairly late in his life. And he bought the patent rights for the Ransom horizontal rotary kiln. Prior to that point, all kilns in the United States were upright kilns that had to be fed by hand continuously. And a rotary kiln could be fed automatically. He actually bought a disused quarry from the Copley Cement Company, and he installed his first rotary cement kiln about a quarter mile up the Lehigh River from the last, and at that point, most highly technological vertical kilns, the Schaffer kilns that Copley had installed. Now, ironically, parts of the Schaffer kilns are still standing. They're the only ones left in the world. That's just kind of by accident. And Navarro's original kiln was torn down, which shows in the next picture, I believe. Can I see the next slide, please? No, I'm sorry. This is an image of the original Sayre kilns, which, as you can see, were upright kilns, and they were on the background there on the western shore of the Lehigh. It's interesting and inaccurate that there is a canal boat on the river here, because this was not a slackwater area. In fact, the ditch part of the canal followed the other bank of the of the river, and the canal's gone there, but it's actually a very lovely park that stretches for about 1.5 miles along the river on the Northampton side. But anyway, sorry. Next one, please. This is apparently the second horizontal rotary kiln that Navarro installed in his plant that was on the Copley side, on the west side of the river. Ironically, this picture was taken shortly before this building was demolished in the 30s because his company eventually became Universal Atlas Cement, which by the 1920s was the largest cement company in the world. It was based across the river in Northampton, and had first gained worldwide fame because the Gatun locks on the Panama Canal were entirely constructed of Atlas cement that came from this plant, actually, as well as the one that had been constructed on the Northampton side. So, like its iron dominance in the years around the Civil War, the Lehigh Valley was between 1890 and 1920 the largest cement producing district in the United States as well. Again, combination of mineral resources, technological know-how, and a good transportation system, which of course by that point was railroads. Next slide, please. Here is the canal again, the one and only canal company that was actually on the river in Northampton, and they actually shipped cement out, presumably in bags or barrels. I'm sure they weren't just pouring it into the canal boats, but they used the canal boats quite a great deal from the time they went into business. It's hard to pin down the name of the company because they changed their name so many times, but the cement company there was founded in the 1890s and it operated until the 1950s. Now, of course, they were not using the canal boats by the 1950s. So this picture was probably taken about 1910 or so. But it's interesting that they were shipping cement on canal boats. Another example of a cheap, albeit slow way to move a heavy, bulky cargo. Next slide, please. And one more look at how even into the 20th century, the canal was still integral to industrial operation. Another industry where the Lehigh Valley and Eastern Pennsylvania in general came to dominate was the silk business. The silk industry expanded out of Paterson into northeastern Pennsylvania, coal regions first in the 1880s because they were in search of a large, docile, semi-skilled population, and that was where they moved some of their silk prep, the preparatory operations before silk could be woven into silk goods. It's definitely a lower skilled process. It could be done by women without much education, and unfortunately also by children. And the coal regions was full of people who had no other occupation because all of the jobs were basically male-oriented, being basically the railroads and the coal mines. So that was the first place they expanded into, but very quickly they also moved into the Lehigh Valley, and a number of enormous weaving mills were constructed in not only the big cities, the cities Allentown, Bethlehem, and Easton, but also a lot of very small towns. By 1910, practically every little town in eastern Pennsylvania had at least one silk mill. This was a very large one in Bethlehem, the Saccoit Mill, which was a subsidiary of a Paterson company. And as you can see, they had a large demand for anthracite coal, which was the ideal fuel for powering the steam engines that ran the belts, that ran the machinery in these mills, because going back to what we were saying earlier on, anthracite's really clean. It doesn't make a lot of soot or ashes. It doesn't make smoke. And so this was the ideal fuel for the silk mills. And most of them ran on anthracite all the way through the entire dominant period. The Lehigh Valley and Eastern Pennsylvania were the world's largest producer of silk goods between 1913 and 1930. And after that, a lot of things changed in the 1930s, of course. The coal industry declined, silk industry moved to the south. But here is a picture of the necessity of having coal delivered by canal boat. Next slide, please. There were still, as late as the World War I era, a number of grist mills that were powered by the canal. This one was in Allentown, ironically just below a very, very large dye house that also used water power from the canal. and probably dumped a lot of nasty stuff back into it while they were going. But this picture was taken about 1920 or so, because this was, you can tell by the dasher decorated by the flags. A man named I.M. Church, who had taken over Lehigh Colon Navigation, actually made several full-length trips on the canal so that he could see firsthand where the inefficiencies were and what needed to be maintained or repaired. And so this was the boat that I.M. Church was riding on. I wonder how much he enjoyed sleeping in that teeny little cabin in the back. Next slide, please. A lot of little coal yards as well, which existed well into the 1950s and 60s, even though, of course, they weren't being delivered by canal boat anymore. This one's in Walnutport. And this is a section of the canal that you can visit because this one is still pretty intact. And Walnutport contains one of the only two original 1828 lock tenders houses, which can be visited at certain times of the year. As you can see, the smaller places relied on this horse-drawn or mule-drawn pulley system with this crane that got the coal off the boats. You can see the coal scoop on the deck of the boat and dumped it into these large piles. Everybody in the Northeast depended on anthracite to heat their houses until the 1920s. Next slide, please. One of the really large city ones. This is in Bethlehem. And this company is actually still in business. They still do sell some coal, but they're mostly in the oil business now. The canal is still intact there as well. And this picture was taken in the 1920s. And there you can see a much more automated way in the going from the canal boat up into this pile. The big yards had conveyor belts, of course. Okay, next one, please. And unfortunately, the maintenance that I.M. Church was investigating did not include a conclusion that they really needed to start dredging better, because by the 1920s, the river and the canal, particularly closer to Mauch Chunk, had become so badly silted that they stopped shipping the coal from Mauch Chunk and they began taking it by train down into Lehigh and Northampton counties. This is the loading area at Laurie's. And from 1923 until the end of navigation, this is where the coal was put on the boats. On the right-hand side, it's probably pretty hard to read, is a bill of lading from one of the last shipments of coal that went down the Lehigh and then down to the Delaware. It was directed to Leadham's Coal Yard in Yardley, it's dated August of 1931. The navigation ceased in the fall of 1931 in October, and almost immediately, Lehigh Colon Navigation, which had gained control of the Delaware Canal in the 1850s. The Delaware started out being part of the Pennsylvania Canal system, and Pennsylvania didn't do a good job of running canals, frankly, and had pretty much abandoned a lot of it by the 1850s. They were very happy to hand control over to Lehigh Colon Navigation. So when the navigation ceased, Lehigh Colon Navigation was very eager to hand it back to Pennsylvania, which is what they did at a ceremony at the Thompson Neely House at Washington's Crossing. And they handed the deed to the canal back to Gifford Pinchot, the conservationist and founder of the Forestry Service, who was governor of Pennsylvania at that time. And that was the end of navigation on the Delaware. On the Lehigh, the dredging, which they should have started earlier, continued until 1942. And what they did was they were dredging coal dirt out of the canal, washing it aboard these dredges. And they were hauling it mostly to the zinc plant that was built in Palmerton in the early 20th century. And so the zinc plant could burn the coal in their processes. And that remained a fairly lucrative thing for Lehigh Colon Navigation for a while. However, what they were really they had begun to make more of their money on was a multitude of little hydroelectric plants, one of which was here in Southeastern. It was actually powered by our section of the canal right here, and it lighted much of Southeastern. So they were really less interested in coal transport at that point. They were still mining it in the Panther Valley, but water power was also providing a fair amount of their annual revenue. However, little by little, mismanagement and a total change of the market and the energy economy of the United States pretty much put paid to Lehigh Coal and Navigation. Mining ended under their auspices in the 1950s. Bethlehem Steel ran some of the mines for a while in the Panther Valley, and but basically oil had supplanted coal as the fuel for heating just about everywhere, and there just was simply no more market for anthracite coal. Plus the fact that the mines were deep, there were other factors as well, and so mining anthracite just became far too expensive to become economically viable, and that was the end of it. Of course, this has resulted in some pretty depressed areas of the former coal regions, and they haven't recovered even at this late date, 60 plus years later. So life is still pretty difficult in some parts, those parts of Pennsylvania. But they're really, and then the population, of course, has declined drastically. So, and end of story. When I wrote the book about the industrial history, I didn't want it to end with, okay, all of, the steel closed and the mines closed and the railroads failed and et cetera, et cetera. And so I had some very interesting conversations with two men who direct economic development corporations, one here in the Lehigh Valley and one up in Luzerne County. And the man in the Lehigh Valley has an easier job of it because industry has diversified drastically in the Lehigh Valley. Manufacturing is still the largest dollar generator, even though there's no enormous industry the way there was anymore, with the possible exception of Mack Truck. But there are a lot of other factors that feed into our economic development here, including, unfortunately, warehouses, because we are an 8-hour drive from something like 60% of the US population. The same thing has happened up in Luzerne and Lackawanna counties, again, because of the confluence of the interstates up there. But they also actually have created a lot of smaller industrial parks. And so there are places where their industrial base is sort of redeveloping. They do not, unfortunately, however, have as strong of an education and skills training base as we do here. And so it sort of remains to be seen how much their recovery will develop in this century. But nevertheless, I mean, the history of the area as a driver of industrial and economic development in the country is just undeniable. And it actually is a basis for what we can still do in the future. So that is the end of my talk. I'll be happy to answer questions, tell you a little bit more about the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor and its trail as it is right now and what we do here. And there is, of course, this, which will tell you that we were established to preserve the pathway that carried anthracite from Wilkes-Barre to Philadelphia by incorporating the Lehigh Navigation and the Delaware Canal. And now the trail and the whole infrastructure of the corridor itself works to connect people to their communities, to our local culture, to recreation, a very big factor in the development of the trail. And the trail is enormously heavily used. And hopefully when people are out enjoying themselves and appreciating our environment, they're also learning a little bit about our industrial history. So thank you very much, and I will be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. And those of you that want to post your questions in the chat, that'd be great. Although I'd like to point out, I made a few notes and I ran out of space on my page of the notes I was making. So I had to go back through and circle a few things that I wanted to pose a couple questions while we're waiting for anybody that wants to put one in the chat. But I do want to make the point too that it's nice to be able to do this through the internet
Yes.
and have you speak And it's also quite interesting. Some of the, it's hundreds of miles away, but there's still a lot of similarities in the canal story and the post-canal story. There's a lot of similarities here across New York State, and especially in the Mohawk Valley. And close to Schoharie Crossing, it's still part of a transportation corridor, and so there's a lot of distribution centers and warehouses being easily connected to the New York State Thruway and Route 5 and 5S. So we can definitely understand that.
Yeah.
And the canalway across New York, the Erie Canal, is much more of a recreational way now. Transportation on the canal does exist in the modern form of that, so far as cargo, but it is more recreationally oriented in the trail. So it's just another great example of how similar these stories really are. And so I appreciate your time and sharing that. And I had a few notes, like I said. Well, if anybody's interested in putting something in the chat as a question, but you talked about Mott Chunk, Jim Thorpe of today, and I actually had come across that a couple years ago it was a misguided detour while driving through Pennsylvania on the way to, I believe it was Baltimore, and we wound up in Carbon County and actually walked around for a while and enjoyed it on a very hot day. But unfortunately, we did miss out on sticking around to watch Gilbert Gottfried at the Opera House that's there.
Right.
But
Which hasn't reopened yet.
that's a shame. Maybe he'll come back to reopen it, and I can get a chance to get down there.
Yeah.
So I was kind of curious, as you referenced, and as we talked about before, we had Tim Roth from the Canal Society of New Jersey, who presented on the Morris Canal, and we've had Bill Merchant from the D&H Canal, and those are both a couple of obvious coal heavy operations. I was wondering, what level of competition was going on there?
There was a lot. There was a lot, and that was also why, among other things, that was the reason why they all jumped to develop railroads too. Because the ones that didn't, the handful of the littler ones that never developed railroads, they were the ones that disappeared really early. The thing is, though, is that although there was a lot of competition, there was also a huge demand, and particularly in the later 19th century. Oh, I see a question about the Union Canal. Yeah, that was one of the ones that didn't last too long. They tried to expand their markets as fast as they, as best that they could. A couple of years ago, we did an exhibit on the anthracite railroads, and I first really learned about the fact that they not only, the railroads ran ships through the Great Lakes, but they actually went as far west as the western tip of Lake Superior. And then the historian at the Superior County Historical Society, which is Duluth, Minnesota, and Superior, Wisconsin, are on either side of, it's either a bay or the mouth of a river, I don't remember which, at the westernmost part of Lake Superior. And the historian for Superior told me that from there they put the anthracite on trains and it went to Montana, where they used it to smelt silver. So, there was just an incredible demand for it. And, it got to the point, I think, where mostly they were kind of trying to preserve their own resources, and everybody had, had enough share of the market. And then there was the Reading. I mean, the Reading Railroad, which controlled pretty much all the coal mining in Schuylkill County, was run by a succession of people who just saw dollar signs and didn't think about the future. I mean, and they became the biggest corporation in the world in the 1870s and went bust. And then they hauled themselves back and became another enormous corporation and went bust again in 1893. That basically was what precipitated the panic of 1893, was the collapse of the Reading Railroad. And because they were over leveraged, they were in debt, and even though there was this tremendous demand for this product that everybody wanted, they just had taken loans and done all sorts of things in expanding the railroad that just didn't pay off immediately, and the bills came due. But then the railroad routes wound up in a lot of cases being, I don't know if it's actually, you can actually say like regulated by the government, but everybody had their space, you know. I mean, only the D&H went north and that sort of thing. So they were more involved, I think, in keeping their workers down than they were competing with each other, because they were all really vicious about keeping their labor, you know,
it's
in bondage, basically.
it's really interesting how companies will exert a tremendous amount of effort in labor relations in that way.
Yeah.
So there's this question that came through about your book and the website, and further up in the chat, I did post a link to the Canal Museum's, the National Canal Museum website, and also Facebook. But if you want to just mention what that is and the name of your new book.
Our website is incredibly easy to remember. I hope especially for people who are interested in canals, because it is www.canals.org.
Excellent.
Yeah, and the Facebook is Facebook National Canal Museum. The Delaware and Lehigh, the Delaware and Lehigh's website is delawareandlehigh.org. So we pretty much overlap. We're one organization now, as a matter of fact. We're one organization, but the museum obviously, you know, stands separate, as it were, from the trail. But we are one organization.
Right. And the other part of that question is, yes, it's being recorded and it will be up on YouTube. So those of you that have been tuning in, you know, you can share it with friends and family, go back and rewatch it. It'll be up there as soon as I'm able to kind of turn that around and post it. I did have a kind of a question on here, because you have this great image of the three canals there,
the forks of the Delaware.
And I'm kind of curious, because you mentioned that there was a ferry, so if you're trying to come off and you want to go into the Morris Canal, you'd have to actually cross through the river to do that. Was there a company that was responsible for that? Was that a private enterprise? Who operated that?
That's one of those lost stories. We assume, and maybe it's not a good idea to assume, and I should check with some of the folks over in New Jersey, that the cable ferry was operated by the Morris Canal. But I don't know that for sure. And the funny thing about that is that New Jersey and Pennsylvania have had arguments about the Delaware for years, which were finally resolved, I guess, when they built the Joint Toll Bridge Commission, which covers all the bridges that go across the Delaware. So we don't really know exactly how that worked. At one point early on, there was a dam across the Delaware, just a little bit below the outlet lock out of the Lehigh. And supposedly that allowed them to pole across, but that would seem, you know, unlikely to be able to be sustained. And there's one image of a Morris boat being ferried, being you know, brought across the Delaware, and the cable is clearly visible. And alongside it is a smaller boat that seems to be sort of like acting not so much like a tugboat, but just sort of like keeping it moving, because there was no power on any of those canal boats. There never was. They were always mule drawn. So there was no other way to power those boats. So they had to be able to, you know, winch it across or whatever it was that they did. And that is one of those things that nobody ever thought to write down, apparently.
One of the many mysteries of history.
Yeah.
And
Like,
you
for
ever
instance,
come across a time machine.
yeah, exactly. I mean, this is why we kind of assume that when they got the, you know, that was why in the early days of the two-way navigation, they were mostly using Durham boats, because when they got to Easton, the Delaware Canal didn't exist yet. So they had to go down the Delaware River. But there is, I mean, that Bodmer print is one of the few things that tell us that what they were using was Durham boats. And we don't know exactly when they began to construct the Lehigh boats, but what we do know, interestingly enough, is that White and Hazard, and presumably Canvas White, we don't know that for sure, designed all the locks on the Lehigh Navigation to be capable of holding two 10.5-foot wide, 88-foot long, 100-ton capacity canal boats at a time. Those locks were built that way from the get-go. That was way bigger than a Durham boat. But then the Delaware Canal, which was built by the state on the cheap, too fast, didn't think things through properly. They built narrow wooden locks, and then they let the water in from the Lehigh River, because that's how the Delaware is watered. And when the force of the water hit those things, they collapsed. And so then they started over again. And eventually, they really ate crow, and they had to hire Josiah White and Louis Coriel, who was a bridge builder in New Hope, to rebuild the Delaware Canal. And it wasn't fully navigable until the beginning of 1835. So all that time, they had to be getting it to Philadelphia somehow. And that's another thing I've never read anything that tells us how. So, and I know people who have read every annual report of Lehigh Coal Navigation, and they can't find that answer either. So,
what you mentioned about that, though, is just another fine example of a government-run infrastructure project.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll cap my comments at that, but
the Erie was government built too, and the Erie was great, But Philadelphia, I mean, Pennsylvania, apart from having a lot of jealousies and carrying on about things like that, when the Delaware was like the second part of it that they started to build, and they sent this guy to Britain, and he looked at the canals in Britain, which just did totally different things. And he's like, oh yeah, if we make this really narrow, then it won't take so much water. And that was their whole thing. Like, the water was going to cost them something. That was the part that was free.
Oh, wow.
And they just never sorted that out. But I did see a question about the Union Canal, and I have to admit that I don't know a whole lot about the Union. It was, as I understand it, it was really kind of like a connector between the Schuylkill Canal and the Pennsylvania Main Line. And it was one of the ones that was very quickly replaced, because it mostly ran through Schuylkill County, and Berks County rather. It was ran through Berks County, not Schuylkill. That it was, the Reading Railroad got hold of it really early, and that was pretty much the demise of it. I think there are still some parts of it that are visible. There's still some bits of it that exist. And of course, that was the one where they built the first tunnel that was built in the United States, the Union Canal hill in Lebanon County. But it didn't. But even so, they had to pole through the tunnel, and the mules walked up the hill and met them on the other side.
But you'd made a good point too about how the canal had kind of built its own nemesis in allowing the railroads to be built. And that's kind of, a lot of times people ask about the Erie, and the railroad drove them out of business, and I just say no, the Erie worked so well that it put itself out of business with its primary function. It created that western expansion, and in your case down in Pennsylvania, it supplied enough coal to really kind of generate the industry to put itself out.
Yeah, to start the iron business that made it possible to build trains, And then too, I mean, then like I said, they got anthracite spread all the way through, New York and New England, and then everybody was using it for stuff. And that was another reason why the industry grew so fast.
And, I want to take this opportunity to thank you again. I know that you've had a busy day, and here it is. It's a Thursday evening. It's been pleasant weather, and you've taken the time to talk with us through the internet, to share an immense amount of great, images and information, and we are super grateful. I thank you very much. Coharie Crossing thanks you, and
thank you.
I look forward to hopefully, the Canals Conference, World Canals Conference, be able to meet you in person, and to have the opportunity to speak. And I can't thank you enough. This has been tremendous. This has been great.
You.
And
thank you. I hope everybody can, at some point or another, maybe even en route from Hagerstown, stop and visit. By the way, I should make a plug. We, in the absence, I believe, of anything happening on the C&O yet, although they might have reopened part of one of their boat rides, we are the only mule-drawn canal boat ride in the East. So you have to go to Ohio if you're going to get on an animal-drawn canal boat ride anywhere. So.
Yeah. So, yeah. What else? Do you have other things going on this season?
Well, the museum is open. We don't have right now. We're still kind of uncertain. Pennsylvania is only beginning to like totally wipe out all the restrictions at the end of next week. So we haven't really planned too much because we're not sure, what we can do. We do dinner cruises on our canal boat, which usually have a theme, and we take the boat all the way down to the end of the section, which has this still functioning lock. We can't go through it because, first of all, the boat has a canopy on it, and it wouldn't clear the bridge that's over the lock. And second of all, if we went through there, we'd be in the river, and the Coast Guard wouldn't like that, and the mules wouldn't like that, and nobody would like that. So we put the boat in, we lower it down. It's not a real deep lock. It's only like 8 feet. And lower the boat down, lift it back up, pull the boat back out of the lock, which is not actually all that difficult. And then turn the boat around, hitch the mules back to it, and go back up. Now, because this is a long, slow ride, and it's not super scenic, it's very relaxing, but it's not particularly scenic. I mean, they didn't build canals to make scenic areas in a lot of cases. So we have a theme, and so we have entertainment, and somebody will do a bit of a talk on the theme, whatever, if it's historic or, whatever. And we have an excellent caterer who has this genius for making menus that match our themes. And so we're hoping we're going to be able to do at least 4 of those this summer. And they're really fun. So, and then we keep our fingers crossed about the weather. So, but other than that, you just have to watch the website and hope that we, get to put together a couple more events.
Great.
So, and I hope I get to visit you as well. So
Yeah, if you're going to be up in the area, just let me know. You get the time tour. I won't charge you a nickel.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Martha, thank you for your time.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.
Be well.
Bye-bye.